Hi, I'm Lynn Wise, and with me today is Rebecca Keller. Today we're going to be talking about the wrap-up of the Paris climate talks. Rebecca, last time we talked about this, we talked about how any agreement that was going to come out of these talks was going to be very difficult to enforce. How was that resolved during the talks, or what kind of agreement did they come to regarding implementation?
So enforcement is still an issue that remains on the table. There's not a lot of language in the final agreement that addresses consequences for failure to meet emissions goals. In fact, the emissions goals themselves are still pretty much voluntary. There's a lot of language that's used, which is should versus shall. So if something should be done, it's considered voluntary, but if something shall be done, it's considered legally binding. And there are aspects to the agreement that do use the shall language. Financing for developing countries is a shall statement, as is monitoring and updating emissions targets and plans throughout the process, but enforcement and actually setting these targets is still a voluntary or up to the discretion of the individual nations. So that constraint still exists.
So in your latest analysis on these talks, you talk about how nations are already kind of moving away from oil and that these talks will accelerate that trend. Can you explain that a little?
So when we look for energy transitions, we're looking for increased implementation of the new energy source. So for instance, in 2014, almost half of the newly installed generating capacity in the world came from renewable sources. So that's one instance where we can see that we're sort of starting to move towards not the next oil, but the next energy transition. Additionally, we're seeing the cost of renewable energy come down, and it's become, especially wind, has become cost competitive with traditional hydrocarbon fuel sources. So we don't need to think about it as green energy policy or a green energy transition. It's simply an energy transition where the technology has just improved to the point where these sources are now cost competitive. So it's no longer a decision based on policy or belief in climate change. It's now based on economics and which technology is most beneficial from a political or an economic standpoint.
So when we talk about these costs, I know that going into the talks, there's a lot of tension between industrialized and industrializing countries on who should shoulder the costs of making this transition. How did that play out during the talks?
So finance was a huge topic. Climate finance was a huge topic during the talks, and it was debated. And ultimately, there is language in the text that make financing through what's called the Green Climate Fund binding. So developed nations have pledged to provide at least $100 billion annually by 2020 to developing nations in order to help ease this transition. Because again, those developing nations don't want to sacrifice their potential for economic growth. And while we are going through an energy transition, it is a slow process. So at the moment, developing nations aren't at the same stage as the developed world. So they're not at the same stage of the energy transition. So they don't want to sacrifice their potential for economic growth by being forced to jump into a transition they're not quite part of yet.
Thank you, Rebecca. It will be interesting to see how these nations implement the accord and how they manage the transition moving forward. For more on this and other topics, please visit stratfor.com.